So I'm going to talk a little bit today about working with children that cause sexual harm. Has anyone worked with these kids before? So you're all new to this population. Good, that's actually good. I just ask you keep an open mind, that's all. So what to expect, I'm going to talk about an overview of working with these kids, a little bit about assessment, more about treatment, more about don'ts than do's, because what we've learned over the years, this is still a new field as far as treatment actually, and what we've learned is don't do this more than do that. Basically the world of sex offender treatment, for lack of a better term, what happened is in the late 70s, early 80s, we said, hey, there are these guys who are raping people and we probably should do something about it. We don't have a real treatment model, but addictions has this relapse model. We like that because it gets people to stop doing things. So we're going to take relapse prevention and apply it to adult sex offenders. So they did that for about 15, 20 years. And then in the late 80s, they said, hey, we have these adolescents that are causing sexual harm. And let's apply that model that wasn't for adults to adolescents and see how that works. So we did that for another 10 or 15 years and said, wait a minute, these are adolescents and adults. We don't treat them the same way with other types of mental health. Why do we do it this way? And so they said, okay, we should do it differently. So we're like the mid to late 90s that they actually started going, oh, maybe we should treat adolescents like adolescents. So this field is pretty much in its infancy. And so we're learning more not to do certain things. Like we don't do relapse prevention anymore. Some people will say, well, that's a key component. I'm like, relapse prevention is about what not to do. Don't do this and don't do that. That's all it's about. And what you want people in treatment to do is you're only going to measure success by what they're not doing. That's not so much success. People in prison aren't doing much, so they must be successful. Not true. So we want to focus on what they are doing, healthy approach, not avoidance when we're dealing with that. So, and I kind of talk about that. Understanding the developmental contextual model, and I'll talk more about that because, again, it's not just developmentally what they went through, but developmentally what they went through in the context of their environment and who they are around. I've got kids who people say all the time, this kid's got no empathy. And then you walk in the home and spend some time with the family and you realize why they don't have any empathy, because no one ever showed them what it was. So that gives context to the development. Compared to a kid that was raised in a nice nurturing home and they're void of a soul, that kid's going to scare me a little bit more. So we want to be careful how we use that. The other thing is we're talking about sexual abuse. And if you want to work in the field of sexual abuse for more than 6 months, you better develop some good defense mechanisms and some coping strategies. My favorite is humor. So you'll find out that I have a little bit of an edgy humor. I promise to keep it in check. I'm in a 12-step program. I'm getting better. But you kind of got to cut the edge off this. Vicarious trauma is really, really real in this field. And when you listen to this day, and I knew I was in trouble years ago because I broke out and I decided I was going to see normal kids, kids who didn't have this problem. And I'm in this therapy session with this kid, and he's talking about being depressed. And I'm like, oh, yeah, right, you're depressed, great. And I realized I was bored and distracted. I had become this trauma junkie that if I didn't have something intense, like he said, he was going through a divorce with his parents, and he started talking about the dog, and I perked up like, oh, he's going to sexually touch the dog. He's going to tell me that. That's when I went, okay, Jeff, you need some help. And I realized I was at a trauma junkie stage, that they weren't talking about something really dramatic, and I wasn't going to pay attention, and I didn't want to be that type of person. So I knew it can alter the way you view the world, okay? So just be careful. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to end with self-care because it's important. So what do these kids look like? Recognize any of these two? These are the Columbine shooters. But when you look at them this way, they look like nice kids. And guess what? That's what they look like. And they look like that. They look like any kid walking down the street. There is no typology. There's no profile. There's no, this is what's a typical sex offender? Please, God, if you watch Dateline NBC, To Catch a Predator, wipe it out of your memory bank. Because those were the stupidest sex offenders I have ever met. Some of those guys got caught twice by them. So that is not what we're talking about with adolescents, and that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. So why do these kids offend? There's a lot of different reasons, and you can start making connections to all those different reasons. There's some key components to this. What I always talk about when I talk about kids who commit this offense, it's kind of like when you're looking at hurricanes. When you look at a hurricane, they all have the same kind of basic, connections to each other, or symptoms to it. But the reality is, when you're trying to connect all these things, and this is not a complex diagram, the reality is it depends what they look like. Because again, going back to the analogy of a hurricane is, they all have similar qualities. Some of them have been exposed to pornography. Some of them have poor social skills. Some of them have sexually abused. The key is, to a hurricane, all those things have to come together at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way to create the perfect storm. The same way with these kids. Lots of kids experience pornography. If pornography was then half the male adolescent population would be at risk, right? If they had poor social skills, there'd be a lot of kids at risk. If victims was a reason that you offended, there'd be a lot of kids. So there has to be a lot of these qualities that come together at the right time and in the right way to create the perfect storm. And I hate to use that, maybe it's a cheesy analogy, but that's the way I look at it with these kids, that they all have the same components. My job when they get to me is, I have to deconstruct it now. I got to work backwards and figure out how did this one react to this one, and then fill in with this one to create this perfect storm. How did it come together for this kid? Again, developmentally and contextually, how did it work?